Well, let's get back to Romans. Romans chapter 1. And for those who weren't here last week, I won't do an extensive review, but we're in Romans chapter 1. And this class is in a long, in-depth study of the book of Romans, verse by verse. And we have looked at Paul has made what I like to call a sin sandwich here between the gospel in verse 17 of chapter 1 and a righteousness from God apart from law that's been made known in chapter 3 and verse 21. And in between that, Paul has to establish why it is that there's a need for the gospel, and that is in the fact that people are not good. They don't do things right. And some of the dregs of human behavior are listed in Romans chapter 1. But by no means is that an extensive and an exhaustive list of all of the depravity of human beings. But we looked at that for the last couple of weeks. This week, I want to look at the expression that Paul uses 3 times. Verse 24, verse 26, and verse 28, where he said God gave them over. Well, now that's where we left off last week. And God gave them over. And we had a couple other translations. God gave them up. I'm having a blank right now. He abandoned them to them. That was the one you brought up, NLT, wasn't it? Where at first when he said he abandoned them, I thought, that's not a good translation. But when you read it in its context, the NLT has, and you weren't here to collect all those accolades from your NLT, you know. But they really do a great job, I think, of bringing forth the idea that Paul has when the NIV says God gave them over. So, Lowley, you've got yours ready right there in verse 24. Would you please read that out of the NLT? Okay, so within the context, it makes a whole lot more sense than just say God abandoned them. No, he abandoned them to their own lustful desires. And so the NIV translates it, God gave them over. And in 26. Yep. Yep. Mm-hmm. So God gave them over, God gave them up, God abandoned them to their own desires. And so I'm sure that when you first read that, we think, especially in the NIV, don't you think there are some people who read that and they think God gave up on them? And in other words, that God he just doesn't care. And that's not it at all. But rather, there's going to come a time when, God's going to let you have your own way. Which makes me a real Arminian, you know, I'm telling you. I don't get Calvinist, but anyhow, that's another story. Because this passage makes it very clear that God allowed them to follow their own path. And he basically gave them over to themselves. And you want to be God? Go ahead. And of course, you know one of my very favorite theological films of all time. And it is what? Thank you very much. And Bruce will remember that back there in the back. And believe it or not, even though, and I have to give this disclaimer, there are a lot of crude stuff in that movie, that's for sure. Well, can you read Romans chapter 1 and not find a bunch of crude stuff? Okay, that is the world. But Bruce was really critical of God. And so God gave him over. And basically, you want to be God? This is the struggle of, did she say yeah? Oh, okay. She's young. She doesn't know. But she's awful cute. Cuteness will get you over a lot for many years to come. But anyhow, That has been man's problem and man's issue since Genesis. And I thought everybody understood when I made the claim that human beings, their number one struggle, no matter what, you can list all these categories here and argue from now till whenever, but it ultimately comes down to this: people want to be God. And I remember someone finally, they challenged me, said, I don't want to be God. Really? You don't? And so I couldn't believe it, that people don't understand that this problem that we have in us goes all the way back to Genesis, and it goes back to us wanting to be like God or being God. That's what the devil tempted Eve and Adam with, was the idea that if you eat of this tree, you'll be like God. In other words, you'll be God. And Satan and the creation of Satan came from the idea of him wanting to take God's place. And that movie, Bruce Almighty, as crude as it may be in many areas, and I don't even know if the author of the movie, or the writer and the director and all that, intended it to be as powerful as it is, but it lays down the problem that Paul's laying down here in Romans chapter 1, is people want to be God. We all want to be God. That's our struggle. And what was the answer? What's the ultimate answer from that movie? No man can handle it. So what did Bruce do that got him in the hospital? Did anybody watch the movie? Am I the only one that watched that movie? What landed him in the hospital? He got hit by a truck. What was he doing that got him hit by a truck? Surrender. He said the most awesome prayer: God, I can't do it. I can't be God. And when that's a point of decision, it's a defining moment in life when a human being can realize, I can't be God. But that's the struggle. And that when in that movie, he basically, in a very good way, did what Paul said here. He gave him over. There you go. You're God now. See how you do with that. How do you do with it? He messed everything up. It was total self-centeredness, total willful self-centeredness. He did everything for himself. It was all about Bruce. And that's the essence of this section, and that it lies in the self-centeredness, wanting to follow the flesh. And I was so impressed. I still owe you, Lori, a, what did I say, lunch, chocolate malt, something. Yeah. Katie, you'd be all of it, right? Good. Okay, I'll go with that. You'd be very impressed with your sister, because I asked, I used the word sarx, and she said flesh. It's like, I'm amazed. Sarx is the Greek word for flesh that the NIV translates sinful nature, and that human carnal nature. And so the essence of this section lies in this contrast between what people know and what people do. What people know and what people do. And God's wrath is directed against those who deliberately suppress the truth for the sake of that which is evil. What is that which is evil? That which is contrary to the will of God. And so God's wrath is being revealed from heaven against all the godlessness and wickedness of men who suppress the truth. How? By their wickedness. And so we think, man, these days are really, really bad. The way human beings are. And there is bad. There's a lot of wickedness. There's a lot of suppressing the truth with wickedness, but it's nothing new under the sun. They've been doing it since the time of Paul and before. Okay? So, that being said, we are now, believe it or not, chapter 2. Man, oh man. And by the way, let me finish up. No, I'm going to do it here in a minute. Okay. Let's look at chapter 2. Okay. Man, I don't need to do all the reading. Who would like to do some reading today? We've got 16 verses I want to look at today. Like we'll really get to it all. Would you like to read that? Could you read just verses 1 through 16? You're a good spot there. You're nice and loud. Excuse me.
Sure. Now remember, I get the NLT.
Very good.
You may think you can condemn such people. You are just as bad. You have no excuse. When you say that they are wicked and should be punished, you are condemning yourself when you judge others. You judge others who do the very same thing. And we know that God, in His justice, will punish anyone who does such things. Since you judge others for doing these things, why do you think you can avoid God's judgment when you do the same things? Don't you see how wonderfully kind, tolerant, and patient God is with you? Does this mean nothing to you? Can't you see that His kindness has returned you from sin? But because you're stubborn and refuse to turn from sin, store up terrible punishment for yourself, for a day of anger is coming, when God's righteous judgment will be revealed. He will judge everyone according to what they've done. He will give eternal life to those who keep doing good and seeking after the glory and honor and immortality of God. God offers. But he will pour out his anger and wrath on those who live for themselves, who refuse to obey the truth instead of live lives with it. There will be trouble and calamity for anyone who keeps doing evil, for the first Jew and also for the Gentile, for the Jew first and also for the Gentile. But there will be glory and honor and peace from God for all who do good, for the Jew first and also for the Gentile. For God does not show favoritism. When Gentiles sin, they will be destroyed, even though they never had God's written law. And Jews who do have God's law will be judged by that law when they fail to obey it. So merely listening to the law doesn't make us right with God. It's obeying the law that makes us right in His sight. Even Gentiles who do not have God's written law show that they know the law when they instinctively obey it without even hearing it. They demonstrate that God's law is written in our hearts for their own conscience and thoughts, either to teach them or tell them that they're doing right. This message I proclaim that the day is coming when God, through Jesus Christ, will judge everyone's secret life.
Okay. Remember your question you asked last week? You had a very good question last week about those who have not heard.
Oh, yeah. Well, I guess he's talking about that.
I think he is.
The Gentiles,
I think he is.
the law and not the law.
And we'll cover that in a minute. But it's very appropriate that you, in fact, read it because you asked the question. So let's go back here because this section that he's read, verses 1 through 16, has to do with God and judgment. And I'm telling you, it can get a little uncomfortable. There's some things in here I think that as we were reading, I could almost hear people thinking, oh, wow, I didn't think it was going to work like that. I thought it worked some other way. And am I right? Am I right in thinking that when people read about the fact that God is one who is going to judge, who wants to be judged, you know? And does it not make people feel uncomfortable? Does it not make Christians feel uncomfortable when they read this section in itself without understanding the entirety of it? Especially if they hadn't already read Romans 1:17. They're just reading about God's judgment. Basically, he's going to say, come in here. I'm going to judge between the good and the bad that you did. Okay, you did enough good stuff, come on in here. If you go with bad stuff, you go into the smoking section. Okay, so I'm sure that that's the case. But let's go back. Let's put it into context. Let's look at what Paul is actually saying. But no doubt about it, in this section, he's talking about God's judgment. And God is a righteous judge. And Paul does an extensive description of God's judgment and how he judges. Okay? We all together on that? And see how it flows. I mean, it's almost like God is dictating this. It's so well put together. And that, he talked about all these bad things that people are doing. All people. And then in this section, he begins with, you, therefore, have no excuse. You who pass judgment on someone else, for at whatever point you judge the other, you're condemning yourself because you who pass judgment do those same things. Okay, I have one question. And this awesome class that is always attuned, they're ready, they're very, broadly read and studied. Who is the you he's talking about? Who is the you? When he says, you therefore, he had just talked about all these sins, and these behaviors that were contrary to the will of God. He is talking about people who were suppressing the truth by their wickedness and gave very detailed description of how they were doing that. And then he switches to that second person, plural. Actually, the way we would say it in English is y'all, but you. Who is the you that he's talking about here? And basically, we're going to come down to two people because this is what we've been talking about. You've brought it up several times, Don, as well as others. Who are the two? We know that the church at Rome, that's who he's writing at. But in the makeup of the church at Rome, what are the backgrounds of these new Christians? Some came from Jewish background, right? And we're going to see he's talking to that Jewish heritage who are Christians and those who are Gentiles, coming out of a Greek or Roman type background. So when he talks about the you, is he referencing the Jewish group, the Gentile group? Are all of them? Yeah, the current believers? I'm sorry, you were saying? All y'all. That's the plural of y'all. Yeah, I do speak Southern. I can translate if you need me to. So this is one of those things where, honestly, those who both translate and those who write commentaries, they struggle with this. Who the you is in this verse, and it's, by the way, this you is consistent all the way through the text that Don just read, all the way through verse 16. You, therefore, have no excuse. He's just talking to Don. He should have just said, Don, you got no excuse, man. But whoever this you is, they're the ones who are not practicing what they preach. They're the ones who are condemning somebody, yet they themselves are doing what they're condemning. Does that make sense? And Paul's calling them on it. Paul, he's good at doing this and confronting people with their hypocrisy. He does it to Peter in the letter to Galatians. And now he's doing it to somebody in Rome. You got no excuse. And they're judging somebody. And in their judgment that they're condemning people, who are they also condemning? Themselves. So, in this verse right here, we have to ask the question then. Because this is the question of the day. Can you judge anybody? It's a loaded question. I'm telling you right now, it's a loaded question. It's just full of bombs throughout it. When I say, is it okay for you to judge your neighbor? Is it okay for you to judge somebody else in the church? It's a loaded question. Isn't it, Betty? You know I got it loaded up. It doesn't matter what you answer. It's going to be wrong. Maybe, maybe not. So now I've set it up for no one to speak at all. Okay, explain that, PJ. She says, can't answer that with a yes or a no. Or I could be with a yes and a no, huh? You want to explain that? Mm-hmm. Yes. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yep. Okay. So PJ is saying that there comes a time when you need to make a judgment, but it depends on, I think you said, your attitude and your approach. Right? Mike, you were going to say something too. Okay. So this is where I can play the devil's advocate then. Okay. So what if someone, let's make it specific, a fellow Christian who you know, who's engaged in some of the behavior that is mentioned here in chapter 1, any of it, that is clearly not something that God approves. Should you say something to that person? There may. Good. Yeah. We must judge the people who are part of the church. And there he's talking about not worrying about judging people outside the church because they're already judged. They're already judged by not being a Christian. Jesus said, I thought Vera was going to go right to that's an excellent passage, going to the Sermon on the Mount, where it talks about judging and making a righteous judgment. What's amazing is in Matthew 7, people like to look at the verse, do not judge or you too will be judged, for in the same way you judge others, you too will be judged. With the measure you use, it'll be measured to you. And yet, if you go over in the same chapter, verse 15 talks about watching out for false prophets. And verse 16 says, by their fruit you will recognize them. And it talks about, a good tree and a bad tree. And verse 20, thus by their fruit you will recognize them. And so, is the problem that Paul's addressing here judgment? That's a better question. See, I set you up with the other question, should we judge? Because I know the cultural climate today, and you hear it all the time, that you can't judge. You shouldn't be judging. Don't be judgmental. But, yes. Absolutely.
If I'm engaging in sins that are in chapter 1, I have no right to go to somebody else and say that, somebody that's engaging in the same thing and say,
Yeah, that's an excellent example. And there's tons of examples. That's an excellent example Jackie was using, where Jesus basically uses humor, where he portrays this guy has a big old log hanging out of his eye, and he says, "Hang on a minute, Mike. I need to get that little splinter out of your eye." Well, and you can almost see that log bumping into you as he's going to try to get it out. He says, "No, take that log out of your own eye." What's he saying? You're not making a righteous judgment, because you yourself are guilty in a bigger way of the same thing that you're trying to help somebody else out with. Yes. Yeah. Well, homosexuality would fit into fornication. Part of it. Yeah, and that's kind of, I picked up on that a week or two ago, and I have many times how it's amazing how people will cherry pick certain things when heterosexual sin is just as bad as homosexual sin. Sexual sin, all fornication, all sexual sin falls under the major category of fornication. It's all wrong, and it needs to be taught, sexual purity in all areas. But yeah, you're right, and so when you judge in regards to whether it's sexual sin or greed or anything else, the problem that Paul's addressing here is not us making a righteous judgment, and that's what PJ was getting at and others. We must judge. I am my brother's keeper. I must make a judgment. There isn't a time when I don't make a judgment. The question is, am I making a righteous judgment, or am I making a hypocritical judgment? Am I guilty of the various things I'm judging someone on? No, I need to get that log out of my own eye. I need to make sure that I'm not guilty of the same sin, and then I can go ahead and make that judgment. Another thing, I think, when people hear the word judgment, they think that I'm making the ultimate judgment on a person. In other words, I'm passing sentence on a person. I'm passing. In other words, if I say this, then you're condemned. No. If we have someone who we love, matter of fact, we need to judge ourselves first. We need to judge ourselves. Well, how am I doing? How am I doing? And all of this is to get us to come to repentance. He talks about that in here for change. And I like how the NLT you read didn't use the word repentance. It talked about making a life change. And so that's what Paul's saying here to these people who are judging and actually condemning people. They're condemning themselves. We must make a judgment. We make it all the time. Are you going to do this or not do that? Is it right or is it wrong? We cannot not judge. The only question is, what are you going to use to make a judgment? And are you guilty of that same thing yourself? And it's amazing how righteously indignant people can be about things that they're not guilty of, but they've got a whole baggage full of stuff that is not this category, but it's another one. So we must make righteous judgments, but it begins with us first. And we need to make sure that that we're walking in God's will to the best of our ability first. And yeah, be careful in this area. And who is the you here? I'm not sure, but I'm thinking he's beginning to work on the Jewish group of people, the Jewish Christians that are there. And I think in regards to his references to the law, and those who didn't have the law but are a law unto themselves, I think that's who he's talking to. And then in verse 17, he's going to pick up on these Jews and the law. In verse 17, now you, if you call yourself a Jew, so is the you in verse 17 still the same people he started with in verse 1? I kind of think it is. I may be wrong, but it doesn't matter. It's still a good question. But the big thing here is, be careful of making a hypocritical, unrighteous judgment. Verse 2, now we know that God's judgment against those who do such things is based on truth. Now, other people make judgments for other kinds of reasons, and they're not based on truth because they're guilty of it as well. So when you, a mere man, pass judgment on them and yet do the same things, do you think that you will escape God's judgment? Well, no. No. And by the way, if you look, go back to verse 32. Go back to verse 32 of chapter 1. All right? Because there it says, although you know God's righteous decree that those who do such things deserve death, they not only continue to do those very things, but also approve of those who practice them. Okay? You do these things and you approve of those who practice them. All right, so you're godless, but at least you're consistent. So you got the hypocrites on one hand who say, you're doing wrong. You're going to hell. But I'm doing the very same thing. Then on the other hand, you've got these people who are not only doing the things, but they approve of you doing them too. So you got two groups of people here that Paul's dealing with. Those who are doing those things and saying it's wrong, but they're doing them. And those who are doing them, and they approve of others doing them as well. They're godless, but at least they're consistent. Consistently godless. And you do these things, and you disapprove and judge those who practice them, you're hypocrites. So we got both groups of people going on. Yes, Don, I'm sorry.
So I remember, I don't know where it is in the Bible, but I remember reading something, and I believe it was Paul that said, like, make your conscience clean so that you can't be judged. Is that right?
I'm not connecting, but
But then,
we'll find it, and we'll look at it. Okay, but let me just get, and then we'll finish this up in this section here. But we're talking about God's judgment. Yes. Okay, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
in Galatians, he's talking about his list about the fruits of the flesh and the fruits of the spirit.
Okay. Yeah.
In the fruits of the spirit, he says, for there is no such law against these.
Oh yeah. Against these things, there's no such law. Yeah.
So I would assume that the things of the flesh, that's what the law is for.
Yeah.
Against that,
Yes.
you know,
Absolutely.
and that's what you're talking about.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
I'm going to find that conscience verse.
Okay. If I was to give you a breakdown of this section we've looked at, we're looking at God's righteous judgment, which is in contrast to these people there who were making a judgment not based on righteousness, but God's righteous judgment. In verses 1 through 4, God's judgment is going to be certain. Do you think you'll escape God's judgment? Which is amazing. These people are judging other people sinfully in that they are doing the very same thing. You think you're going to escape God's judgment? No, you're not going to. You're just condemning yourself when you do that. Verses 5 through 11, God's judgment is good. It's good. let's say verse 9, begin there. There will be trouble and distress for every human being who does evil, first for the Jew, then for the Gentile. But glory, honor, and peace for everyone who does good, first for the Jew, then for the Gentile. For God does not show favoritism. His judgment is good, and it's good to all, and he does not show favoritism. And that's, again, why I think the you he's talking about here is that group of people who would have that Jewish background. Why would I say that? Because they thought they had an inroad simply because of their heritage. They thought, we're Jews. We're in. Doesn't matter what we do. We're in. We got a leg up on these Gentile Christians, we Jewish Christians, because we got the Jewish heritage. We got our name going for us. We got a pedigree. We're in. And I think that's where Paul's saying, no. Don't think that just because you have a Jewish background, you're going to get in. Because God doesn't show favoritism. He's going to make a good judgment. Okay? And it's going to be based on good versus bad. All right. Then the last section, verse 12 through 16, his judgment is fair. His judgment is fair. And that brings in this really interesting section that I think is the only or maybe the best section, Don, that answers Don's question. What about those people who don't know God? What about those people who never heard the gospel? What about those people who've never even seen a Bible, read a Bible? Missionaries never come into their territory. They don't know. Well, this section here seems to address that as good as anything I've ever seen before. And what is that? That God has placed on people's hearts from the beginning, all people, human beings, that they know what's good and they know what's not good, and that the requirements of the law are written on their hearts and on their conscience, and that by doing those things right or going against those things, they either condemn themselves or defend themselves. So what am I saying? I'm saying that Paul seems to be writing that the people who don't have the law, do the things that the law requires, even though they don't have it, are more righteous than these folks over here who are being judgmental, and they have the law, and they're not even doing it. Well, does that mean we don't go out and share the gospel? Absolutely not. Absolutely not. We still should share the gospel. But God is going to be fair, is the point that I'm going to make. And I think no matter how you slice and dice it here in verses 12 through 16, God is going to be fair. Verse 16, this will take place on the day when God will judge men's secrets through Jesus Christ, as my gospel declares. And so he's going to make a fair judgment. And I don't know any other way to put it other than I know that God has made a provision for those who have never had an opportunity to hear his word, because that has happened and may continue to happen until more people like Natasha Getz goes out to these unreached people groups, which she is just really an inspiration to me to be doing that. But it will be fair. That's what Paul is saying. And it will also be absolutely, positively certain. So beginning in verse 17, he's going to now, I think, dial into who the you is. Now you call yourself a Jew. If you rely on the law and brag about your relationship with God, if you know his will and approve of what is superior because you're instructed by the law, if you're convinced that you are a guide for the blind, a light for those who are in the dark, an instructor of the foolish, a teacher of infants, because you have in the law the embodiment of knowledge and truth, you then who teach others, don't you teach yourself? You who preach against stealing, do you steal? You who say that people should not commit adultery, do you commit adultery? You who abhor idols, do you rob temples? You who brag about the law, do you dishonor God by breaking the law? As it is written, God's name is blasphemed among the Gentiles because of you. Oh, man, he comes down hard on these guys, doesn't he? And that's why I think these may be one and the same in reference to who the you is. And they're not being a good influence to that Gentile congregation there at Rome. I ran out of time. Thank you very much. We'll pick up right there in chapter 2. Wait a minute. What are we doing next week, Cheryl? Probably not Romans. Okay. So when I'm back, we will pick up right there in chapter 2 where Paul is really putting the hammer down on the Jewish Christians there in Rome. All right. Thank you. Thank you.